I'm going to speak today, or divide my comments here into kind of three themes: protest, polarization, and power disparities. Through this, I'll talk about some of the kind of research subjects of my own work, which, as my title indicates, think about whiteness, think about Americanism and nationalism in recent American history. For most of the 20th century, nobody really wanted to talk about trade and investment politics. It was not a, speaking of popular culture in US politics, as people on this panel have thought a lot about, it was not part of popular culture. It was the reserve of industry lobbyists meeting in back rooms discussing obscure industrial regulations. In general, rich countries wanted open markets, and poor countries wanted protected markets, they wanted to protect their industries. Some of that changes in recent American history, and I think those changes were pretty important. The World Trade Organization was created in the 1990s as an entity to both promote trade liberalization, more international trade, and also to create what it considered a rules-based international trading regime. In the decade of the 1990s, the term globalization became a household word. Bill Clinton and others pushed the major meetings of the WTO to be held in the United States, and ultimately the process was put up to bidding, and Seattle won. So what happened? Many of you may remember or have seen images of this, and we owe that partly to television, but there was a major protest. There were, for a lot of people, surprising acts of property destruction. There was a lot of tear gas. Some of the meetings were canceled because of this. The objectives of Bill Clinton and others to work out agreements, especially with developing countries, completely failed. So a lot happened, a lot didn't happen. But ultimately, the enduring message of those protests were of, partly through the media, were of the smashed Starbucks window and of the tear gas. So that takes me to my second kind of theme here, which is polarization. People didn't go out and smash Starbucks windows because they were really concerned with tweaking milk tariffs between the US and Canada or something. Something else was up. And what we see in the late 20th century is that organized interests began to try to popularize international trade and investment rules and frame them in ways that would be compelling for everyday Americans. For usually the story of the Seattle protests is one of the left and of liberalism and progressivism, which is part of my research project. For people on the left and for liberals, for unions, the WTO and internationalized trade meant the facilitation of offshoring of jobs. For environmentalists, the WTO represented the body that could overrule a domestic environmental law saying that it was an unfair trade barrier. So that was the kind of left. But my research kind of thinks about how there was more to it in the 1990s. Indeed, the people who were maybe cheering the protests on November 30th, 1999 or December 1st were absolutely unions, consumer groups, but it was also the John Birch Society. It was also Pat Robertson, the white conservative, white evangelical. It was also white nationalists for whom the WTO was the latest symbol of a globalist, usually Jewish, conspiracy to overrule the sovereignty of the American people. I suspect that none other than Donald Trump was also celebrating the night of November 30th or December 1st. Many people don't remember or know that Donald Trump first tried to run for president as the Seattle protests were getting going. He tried to do so with the Reform Party, and he was advocating a kind of America first, anti-globalization politics. So, in other words, the Seattle protests are also about, tell us something about the right as well as the left. Perhaps one of the products of, we're talking about recent American history, perhaps one of the cultural products is the term frenemy. This a sociologist named Nancy Whittier has actually written a book about political frenemies. And here we have the case of frenemies, the extreme left, extreme right, not so much collaborating in Seattle, but absolutely cohabiting the same kind of political space. So part of my research is kind of thinking about what that really means. Ultimately, I'm arguing that white liberals and progressives ultimately sought to kind of counter the challenge of this growing white nationalist right. And remember, the 1990s were the decade of the Timothy McVeigh bombing of the Murrah building, Waco, the rise of the militia movement. So the white liberals and progressives hope to respond, or try to respond to the rise of the right in general by seeking to reclaim this idea of America and a vulnerable or threatened America. But they did so ambivalently, and that's why I think about ambivalent Americanism, because these were liberals and progressives fretted about the ways that embrace could reinforce exclusionary forms of white supremacist forms of nationalism. So my third theme I'd like to think about for today then is power disparities. During the protest planning, organizations from working class communities of color in Seattle and elsewhere criticized the protest planning for the ways that it marginalized the concerns and the leadership of those kinds of working class organizations of color. Shortly after the protest, someone who I think is an important organic intellectual from the late 20th century, Elizabeth Betita Martinez, wrote a piece called "Where Was the Color in Seattle?" And indeed, that's part of what my research, that question is part of what my research seeks to answer by tracing out some of the historical undercurrents that ultimately played out in Seattle. I think that the ways that the ambivalent Americanism of white progressives and liberals were partly indeed why the protests were, like Martinez claimed, so white. Secondly, the second power disparity I'd just like to mention has to do with Seattle in kind of global history and transnational history. The protests were often referred to as sparking something, and indeed after the Seattle protests there was a wave of such protests in cities around the world. But I think an important way to think about its transnational impact is actually to think about the transnational histories of these movements, and also the ways those histories of struggle, especially in the global South, didn't really get translated or recognized in protests like Seattle. My research in Mexico and that of many others shows clearly the ways that everyone from farmers to workers in countries like Mexico had been advocating and organizing to confront some of the inequalities created by trade liberalization for at least 2 decades. The same can be said for different post-independence governments of decolonized nations. So there's a long story there in the global South. But I guess I'm going to close my comments just with just by closing with the notion that Seattle was indeed the start of something, but also reflected historical currents from at least the last 2 decades, the prior 2 decades.
And in November, we will open the WTO's ministerial conference in Seattle. This will be the largest trade event ever held in the United States, bringing heads of government, trade ministers, business executives, and citizen groups to Seattle from all over the world.
Later into the piece, she writes that if Seattle host committees chaired by the Microsoft CEO Bill Gates and the Boeing CEO Philip Condit fears that the protests can overshadow the event, trade diplomats are even more concerned that the negotiations themselves could implode.
Yeah, well, the stakes are extremely high in this case. And the run-up to Seattle had been pretty negative for the possibility of success until recently with the United States and China reaching the agreement on the WTO. But all of these protesters are going to be around because it's a great international platform, and because for a lot of the people from the labor people and Ralph Nader on the left all the way to the right, and the Pat Buchanan supporters, this is the time when they feel they have to stop the growth in international trade and internationalism before it just gets out of control and becomes almost a consensus.
Can you explain to me how we can possibly survive by letting other countries charge us what they want to, and we're the good guys all the time?
Thank you for your call. Let me just say, we have survived pretty well for the last 50 years with very low tariffs compared to the rest of the world.
Demonstrations come in different flavors. Americans historically have reacted well to serious demonstrations. I expect the Labor March Tuesday will be an orderly and serious affair. Americans do not historically react well to people blocking traffic, or even worse, destroying property, namely automobiles. That hits home.
Many people heading to Seattle are deeply concerned about the environment, human rights, and the impact of global poverty. So are we.
Joe, is there any concern that all these protests that are going to take place this week in Seattle will just overwhelm any sort of substantive work that might be done?
No, I don't think so. I think there's important work that's going to go on.
As a farmer, I can certainly see some huge advantages to any advances we might make in the WTO talks. As you know, Europe charges about a 50% tariff on anything I might want to export from my farm. Well, America only charges 5% on anything food products coming in. So we have a huge stake in these negotiations. Secondly, I refuse to worry about losing my sovereignty to the WTO until they have a Navy and an Air Force.
That is a good point.
With one shoe fits all.
Oh, no, I don't.
That is why I'm praising you.
No, yeah, I know. But Ralph, I would just add one thing, since you and Vandan have been talking about monopoly. I see trade opening as against closing as essentially a way in which you get people, big firms, IBM, Hitachi, NEC, to compete with one another. If we really had closed markets, I mean, someone like Bill Gates could really take us in a very big way.
This is not free trade. Here's the GATT agreement. 500 pages is just the beginning. These are who makes the rules, and it isn't the people. It's concentrated corporate power utilizing the governments of the world against us.
That the best thing we can do is to maintain vigorous world trade, hope for its expansion, and as for the WTO, fix it and not nix it.
Look at a couple of front pages. The Baltimore Sun has an AP photograph, and the headline, "Protest Disrupts Trade Talk."
WTO and those people know we're serious.
That same photograph is in USA Today. Stop the WTO. A short quote from one of the 75 congressmen out there. Representative David Dreyer of California said he was appalled at the mob tactics being used to stifle debate and dialogue.
And here we stand on the streets of America, and we say to our political leaders, shame on you. Shame on you.
And that photo appears again in the New York Times. A chaotic intersection of tear gas and trade talks is this headline. David Sanger and Joseph Kahn write from Seattle, and in the body of this, they write the following. It was an embarrassing beginning to negotiations that the administration had once been reluctant to hold at all. But in a move many American officials clearly regretted today, the White House reversed position, and President Clinton volunteered to play host to the session here in hopes that opening the talks at home would give Washington bigger sway on the agenda.
What they are telling us in the streets here is this was an issue we used to be silent on. We're not going to be silent on it anymore. We haven't necessarily given up on trade, but we want to be heard. The sooner the WTO opens up the process and lets people representing those who are outside in, the sooner we will see fewer demonstrations, more constructive debate, and a broader level of support in every country for the direction that every single person in this room knows that we ought to be taking into the 21st century.
We are walking into the pages of history. Today we start a movement. We start an association of the diverse groups, the environmentalists, the religious folks, and everybody together to form a coalition that will change the way we do business in the 21st century. This is only the first day. This is the first round of a long fight. And maybe we won't win today, but we're going to win tomorrow. And we're going to do it together, all of us together. Let's get to work and let's start marching. Let's do it. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
The protests have already had a big impact. I think the WTO Secretariat has been taken aback by the protests from environmental groups, from labor groups. They've already succeeded, I think, in sort of shifting the agenda of the organization. So the WTO and its members are certainly paying attention to the protests that are taking place here in Seattle. On the other hand, I think amongst some of the members, they feel that a lot of these protests are being driven by perhaps U.S. interest groups, environmental groups in advanced economies, labor groups in the United States. And so some of these countries see these protests as perhaps reflecting the interest of certain groups within the United States and other richer countries rather than the membership as a whole.
The WTO has outgrown the processes appropriate to an earlier time. Just as issues of transparency may affect outside perceptions of the WTO, issues of transparency also impact internal perceptions of the WTO by the member economies themselves.
So there was chaos, but there was also great continuity. There was perseverance among the most horrific abuse, and with that, optimism.
Thank C-SPAN and the Center for those great clips. They really do show some of the dynamics that I'm interested in terms of the protests, but I think some of the dynamics that are simply the most important ones. So those are really great. I think if we think about recent American history, one of the narratives that many people refer to is that of growing polarization. So the political polarization of today and its origins in recent American history. And I think the Seattle protests tell us something interesting about that. I mean, I've already mentioned, I think, that there were frenemies there between the left and the right. But these clips, I just want to comment, I guess, that Donald Trump has said that I think the quotation was, I believe in free trade, but only if it's fair trade. If these were historians, the unions and the consumer groups from the 90s could sue him for plagiarism. It's just right out of the book. So there's something interesting about political polarization that gets maybe challenged around these issues. But also we see a lot of foreshadowing. I mean, there were significant numbers of the population in 2016 whose first choice was Donald Trump and whose second choice was Bernie Sanders, or Bernie Sanders rather. And so we see previews of that here in Seattle, I think. The video clips showed as the spokespeople of the resistance to the WTO, on the one hand, Jim Hoffa. So Hoffa was, in particular, one of the figures from seemingly the liberal side of things who, months after this, invited Pat Buchanan to be the spokesperson at one of the next big kind of global justice or anti-globalization rallies. And in fact, Hoffa courted or visited Buchanan as well as Bush, and made overtures to even endorse them for the presidency the next year. The other spokesperson here we see, or one of them, is Ralph Nader, and I think that's also fitting. So I mentioned that, you know, part of the reason this all happened is that people like Nader tried to popularize the international trade and investment policy in the 1990s. He tried to make it a household set of conversations himself, and he was perhaps the most influential in doing that. He was also the target of criticisms for that from the left. So in Seattle, the organization Legacy of Leadership, Equality, and Organizing was a working class, largely black and brown organization with roots in the 1970s kind of third worldist Marxism, and had really been central in fighting for the desegregation of the building trades in Seattle since the 70s. But they had developed their own kind of global justice set of programs and networks throughout the 90s, especially the late 90s, and had in fact hosted already two international gatherings of workers, including from the Global South. So things that were very, they in fact had kind of done the kinds of things that organizers like Nader were kind of trying to do in Seattle, but really felt like they weren't consulted. Their leadership was denied, and they ultimately forged their own coalition for the Seattle protests as a kind of rejection of that centralized leadership of Ralph Nader and others, who mobilized this kind of this ambivalent Americanism that I've spoken about. Finally, the Seattle protests, in fact, weren't in 1999. Were not, in fact, even the first kind of global justice or anti-globalization protests in Seattle themselves. The APEC meeting in 1994 itself had brought protests. So I guess just to conclude, I think that Seattle both is the result of a lot of historical dynamics, but it also previewed some things we saw in the later decades.